Welcome to Life Stories, where we share real-life experiences that touch the heart and make you reflect on life's important lessons. In today's story, we'll take you through a journey of family betrayal, tough decisions, and the power of standing up for what's right. A mother fights to protect her son's future from the very people who should be supporting him, their own grandparents. With emotions running high and relationships on the line, this story will leave you questioning the lengths we go to for the ones we love. Don't miss out. Subscribe to our channel to start today's story. It was supposed to be a night of celebration. My son Ryan had just graduated from high school, a milestone that marked the end of years of hard work. From long nights spent studying for AP exams to juggling extracurriculars and a part-time job, he had earned his place in the world. His dream college had accepted him, and we were all so proud of how far he'd come. He had worked tirelessly to get here, and tonight, the evening was meant to honor him. We had planned this dinner for weeks. Tom, my husband, and I had saved up for it, wanting to make it special. A nice steakhouse in the city had seemed like the perfect place to mark the occasion. The atmosphere was warm, the clinking of glasses and chatter from other tables filled the air. But for us, it was a moment of quiet pride. Ryan had made it. As we sat down at the table, my daughter Chloe, who was only a few years younger than Ryan, sat quietly next to him, looking up at her older brother with admiration. I could see the pride in her eyes as she watched him, and it warmed my heart to think about the journey Ryan had been on. We toasted, laughed, and shared stories about his years in school. It felt like everything was falling into place. And then it happened. My mother, Susan, who had been unusually quiet throughout the meal, suddenly picked up her glass. A gleam in her eye that I couldn't place. She tapped her fork against the side of the glass, and the room fell silent. The people around us turned to look, and she rose from her chair with that smile she always wore when she had something to say, an almost smug, self-satisfied grin. Tom raised an eyebrow, sensing something was off. But neither of us could have anticipated what came next. "We have an announcement," Susan said, her voice carrying through the restaurant, drawing all eyes to her. "We've decided that Ryan's college fund will be going to Zachary instead. He needs it more." My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my entire body freeze. I glanced at Tom, who had gone still, his grip tightening around his fork. Ryan's face went ashen, and Chloe, sensing the sudden change, looked between us, confused. My father, George, nodded approvingly beside Susan, his face full of that familiar, calm assurance. The words hung in the air like an electric charge, sending a jolt of shock through me. I felt the world tilt. Zachary, my nephew, my brother's son, the child who had always been favored over my own, the child who my parents had always bailed out of trouble. No questions asked. The child who, despite all his mistakes, never seemed to be held accountable for his actions. And now, he was going to take Ryan's future from him. I could feel my blood pressure rising. The years of biting my tongue, of watching my parents dismiss and undermine my children, suddenly boiled over. I had spent so many years accepting the way they treated me, and the way they always seemed to choose my brother's family over mine. But this was different. This was not just about favoritism or emotional manipulation. This was about my son's future. The very thing Ryan had worked so hard for. And they were taking it from him. Ryan had always known, deep down, that his grandparents didn't favor him the way they favored Zachary. He'd seen it in the little things, the casual dismissals, the way his achievements were downplayed, the constant stream of praise for everything Zachary did. But this was proof. In their eyes, Ryan didn't matter. And in that moment, I felt something break inside me. Tom, to his credit, was quicker than I was to react. He leaned back in his chair, took a long sip of his beer, and chuckled, a soft, almost amused chuckle. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "That's funny," he said, his tone sharp, "because we moved it last month." Susan blinked, her smile faltering. George's expression wavered. It was as if the ground had been pulled from under them. They had no idea how to respond. "What?" Susan asked, her voice turning cold now. Her eyes narrowing. Tom smiled, leaning forward. Yeah, we saw this coming. So we moved Ryan's college fund out of your reach a few weeks ago. For a brief moment, everything went silent, and then it exploded. Susan's face turned bright red, her eyes filling with fury. You had no right, she screamed, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. George slammed his fist on the table, causing the silverware to rattle. You can't do that, he roared, his face contorted in anger. That money was meant for family. My heart pounded in my chest. Ethan is family, I said, my voice shaking, but strong. That fund was his. You had no say in it. You're being selfish. And then it really sank in. They had never planned for that money to be for Ryan. Not really. They had always been waiting for the right moment to swoop in and take it. And they had tried to play the perfect game. But we were done. I looked at Ryan, who was sitting there, pale and silent. I could see the hurt in his eyes. And my chest tightened. He had spent his life trying to earn their approval. But this moment was a brutal lesson. It wasn't about him. They had never cared about his future. They were willing to sacrifice it for Zachary. Jason needs this. Susan spat, her voice bitter. You know how hard things have been for your brother. We're fixing things for him. And you're ruining it. That was when everything fell apart for me. Fixing things? I repeated, my voice trembling. You mean the way you fixed things last time when Zachary stole from us? Or the time he got arrested and you paid off the charges? Or when he wrecked my brother's car and you bought him a new one? My father growled, his face twisted in anger. That's not the same thing, he snapped. It is the same thing, I said, my voice rising with every word. You're teaching Zachary that he can keep making mistakes. Keep taking from others, and you'll always fix it for him. Meanwhile, Ryan worked his ass off for everything he's earned. And you're taking that away from him. You're stealing his future. Susan scoffed. Oh please. Ryan can take out loans like everyone else. That was it. That was the moment I knew there was no coming back from this. I turned to Ryan, who had risen from his chair so fast that it scraped against the floor. His face was pale, his voice trembling but strong. You know what, he said. His words clear despite the pain in his eyes. I don't need anything from you. I don't need your money. And I definitely don't need you in my life. Tom stood up too, placing a hand gently on Ryan's shoulder. Let's go, he said calmly. We don't owe them another second of our time. And with that, we walked out. They screamed after us, calling us ungrateful, telling us we were tearing the family apart. But as I looked at Ryan, his head held high despite the pain in his eyes, I knew we had done the right thing. And though I knew this would never be the same, I also knew there was no turning back. Not now, not ever. It wasn't over. That much became painfully clear as the days passed. The moment we left the restaurant, we knew things had shifted irrevocably. But what I didn't expect was just how far Susan and George would go to try to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. They weren't just angry, they were relentless. In the days that followed, the phone calls started. First, it was my mother, her voice shrill and demanding. How could you do this? She screamed, her words laced with venom. You've betrayed the family. You have no idea what you've done. I didn't pick up. I couldn't. The thought of hearing her try to justify her actions was too much. But the messages kept coming, each one angrier than the last. And then, it was my father. His tone was colder, but no less filled with righteous fury. You'll regret this, he said in one voicemail. You've torn the family apart for nothing. You've made a terrible mistake. It wasn't the first time my parents had resorted to guilt trips. But this time, it felt different. There was an edge to their threats that unsettled me. The real shock came when my brother, Nathan, sent a text 2 days later. The message was brief. I don't know what's going on, but Zachary needs that money more than Ryan does. You're being selfish. That was all he said. No questions. No attempt to understand what had actually happened. Just a direct judgment that we were in the wrong. I didn't reply to any of them. There was nothing to say. I had already made my feelings clear. But that wasn't the end. A week after the dinner, it got worse. Mark, my husband, received an unexpected call from our bank. I was in the kitchen when I heard him ask, "Excuse me, what withdrawal?" His voice sounded confused, and I froze. I could hear him asking more questions, his tone shifting from surprise to concern. The call lasted only a few minutes, but by the time he hung up, his face was tight with anger. "They tried to access Ryan's fund," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart dropped to my stomach. My parents, Susan and George, had called the bank, pretending to be us, claiming that we had authorized an emergency withdrawal. My mind raced. The audacity, the sheer gall of them to go behind our backs like this. To try to take the money by pretending to be us. But the bank had been smart. They flagged the request as suspicious and called Mark directly. I was shaking, furious beyond belief. "They can't do this," I said, my voice trembling with rage. "They can't just take what's ours." But they tried. They went as far as they could. And yet, it wasn't enough. They had crossed a line. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was a battle of wills, of control. I grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling as I found my father's number and dialed it. When he picked up, I didn't wait. I let loose, my voice sharp and full of disbelief. "You actually tried to steal from us," I shouted, unable to keep my anger in check. "What is wrong with you?" He didn't even sound guilty. "You left us no choice," he said coldly. "We wouldn't have had to do this if you weren't being so unreasonable." Unreasonable? I almost laughed. This wasn't about being unreasonable. This was about them trying to take what wasn't theirs. And when they couldn't, they resorted to underhanded tactics. My blood boiled. I was seeing red. "You tried to commit fraud," I shot back. "It's our money, our son's future, and you think you have the right to steal it?" His response was chilling. "We contributed to it," he said, his tone calm as if this was all justified. I nearly choked. "You never contributed a single cent to Ryan's fund. You're remembering wrong." My father's voice turned smooth. "Manipulative. If we were to bring this to court, I guarantee the judge would agree that we have a right to it." I felt my stomach churn. A court battle? They had the audacity to threaten us with legal action over a fund they had no right to? I turned to Mark, who was now standing beside me. His face set in a hard line. "They wouldn't win," he said firmly. "They don't have a leg to stand on." But I wasn't so sure anymore. My parents had always been masters of manipulation, twisting the truth to fit their needs. If they were willing to go this far, what else were they planning? And that was when I knew this was far from over. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about control, about proving who had the power in this family. And if they wanted to fight, they were going to get one hell of a fight in return. The situation spiraled further out of control in ways I never could have predicted. After the bank incident, things quieted down for a few days. But I knew better than to believe it was over. It felt like we were just waiting for the next shoe to drop, and it did. In a way that shook me to my core. It started innocuously enough. A thick envelope appeared on our doorstep. I saw it when I came home one afternoon. Sitting there, its return address from a law firm I didn't recognize. My stomach dropped. I knew something was wrong. But I didn't expect this. I grabbed the envelope, my hands shaking as I tore it open. Mark was in the living room, and I could see the concern in his eyes as I scanned the letter. My eyes skimmed the first page, then the second, and by the third, I was holding the paper with trembling hands. "They're suing us," I whispered, the words barely escaping my lips. Mark jumped up from his seat, walking over to me in a few long strides. He snatched the papers from my hands, his face turning grim as he read through them. "What are they claiming?" he asked, his voice low, almost deadly calm. I could feel my heart beating in my chest as I read the next line. "They're saying they co-funded Ryan's college savings," I said, my voice rising in disbelief. "They're claiming that we transferred the money without their consent, and they want it back." I could barely contain my anger. "They're saying they own part of the fund." Mark swore under his breath, shaking his head. This is complete nonsense. But despite his words, I could see the worry in his eyes. My parents were good at one thing, lying. They had been manipulating situations for years. Always getting their way, twisting the truth until they were the victims. And now, they had taken it a step further, using the legal system to try to get what they wanted. But that wasn't the worst part. What really terrified me was that they might actually win. The way they twisted reality. The way they could make themselves appear so righteous. It had worked in the past. What if it worked again? Over the next few days, we scrambled to gather every piece of documentation we could find. Bank statements, transfer records, every single deposit we had ever made into that account. We knew we had done everything legally. But my parents had one advantage. What if the court saw things differently? What if the $2 my parents had contributed all those years ago, when Ryan was a baby, gave them some kind of leverage? I didn't know how far they would go, but I feared it would be far enough to drag us all through the mud. They were vicious when they wanted something, and I wasn't sure if we had the strength to outlast them. Then, as if things weren't complicated enough, the real bombshell dropped. 3 days later, Mark got another call from the bank. This time, the news was even more frightening. The IRS had flagged us for an audit. They've reported us, Mark said, his voice tight with frustration. They've accused us of tax fraud. They've told the IRS that we've been hiding money and misreporting our funds for years. The room seemed to spin as the weight of it hit me. The IRS? I couldn't breathe. My parents weren't just trying to take the money, they were trying to destroy us. They were willing to drag us through a legal battle, make us look like criminals. All because we had said no. The worst part was that it wasn't just about us anymore. It was about Ryan. The IRS audit meant that his college scholarship, the one he had worked so hard to get, was now on hold. The college had flagged his account due to the review. His future, his whole life, was suddenly on hold because of this ridiculous fight with my parents. I wanted to scream. I felt like we were drowning. It wasn't just about the money. It wasn't even about the lawsuit. It was about Ryan's future being threatened by people who were supposed to love him. People who were supposed to support him. And now, they were trying to tear it all down. I couldn't let this happen. I couldn't stand by while my parents tried to destroy everything Ryan had worked for. They had crossed a line. And I was done playing their game. If they wanted war, they were going to get one. The anger that had been bubbling inside me for years finally reached a boiling point. It wasn't just about protecting Ryan's college fund anymore. It was about standing up to the lies, the manipulation, the constant favoritism that had poisoned our family for so long. Mark and I began planning our next move. I knew that if we didn't act quickly, my parents would win. They had already shown how far they were willing to go, and now it was our turn to fight back. And this time, we weren't going to back down. As the days passed, we could feel the weight of everything lifting. Despite the court battles, the IRS investigation, and the constant harassment from my parents, something inside me had shifted. I realized that no matter how hard they tried to break us, they couldn't touch the strength of our family. Ryan had earned his place in the world, and no one, not even Susan and George, could take that away from him. In the end, the court ruled in our favor. The money was ours, and we had won the legal battle. But the victory didn't feel as sweet as I had imagined. I had lost something far more valuable in the process. My parents. It hurt, more than I could ever express. Cutting ties with family, especially parents, is a pain that lingers long after the dust has settled. But as I looked at Ryan, his future ahead of him, I knew it was the right choice. After everything, Ryan went on to attend the college he had dreamed of. His scholarship was reinstated, and he started a new chapter in his life. As for me, I found peace in knowing that we had fought for what was right. And that sometimes, protecting your children means making the hardest decisions. I thought I would feel guilty, but I didn't. What I felt was relief. I had chosen my family, my true family, and it was a decision I would never regret. If you want to hear more life stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Don't miss out on the next video where we dive deep into more real-life lessons. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.